Sarah Martinez stared at the prescription bottle on her kitchen counter, its orange plastic surface catching the afternoon light streaming through her apartment window. The label read, "Take as needed for anxiety." But she knew the pills inside had become more than just medicine. They had become her escape from a world that felt too heavy to bear. At 34, Sarah felt ancient. The divorce papers had been finalized 6 months ago, taking with them not just her marriage but her sense of purpose. Her ex-husband had moved on quickly, already posting pictures on social media with a younger woman who smiled in ways Sarah had forgotten how to. The house they had shared for 8 years was sold, leaving Sarah with a modest settlement and a studio apartment that felt more like a cage than a home. Her job at the insurance company provided just enough money to survive, but not enough to truly live. Each day blended into the next in a monotonous cycle of spreadsheets, claim forms, and polite conversations with coworkers who seemed to inhabit a different universe. They talked about weekend plans, family gatherings, and future dreams while Sarah counted the hours until she could return to her apartment and disappear into the numbing embrace of sleep. The isolation had crept in slowly at first. Friends from her married life had chosen sides or simply drifted away, uncomfortable with her new single status. Her family lived 3 states away, and their weekly phone calls had dwindled to monthly check-ins filled with awkward silences and well-meaning advice that felt impossible to follow. "You just need to get back out there," her sister would say, as if finding love was as simple as changing the channel on a television. Sarah had tried briefly. She downloaded dating apps and sat through coffee dates with men who seemed nice enough, but felt like strangers speaking a foreign language. They talked about their careers, their hobbies, their 5-year plans, while Sarah struggled to see past the next 5 days. The effort of pretending to be interested, of smiling and laughing at appropriate moments, left her exhausted for days afterward. The prescription had started innocently enough. Her doctor had noticed her weight loss, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands shook slightly during appointments. "Just something to take the edge off," he had said, scribbling on his pad, "to help you through this difficult transition." But transitions were supposed to lead somewhere, and Sarah couldn't see any destination ahead except more of the same emptiness. She had been taking more pills than prescribed for the past month. Not enough to cause immediate harm, but enough to create a constant fog between herself and the sharp edges of reality. The world moved around her like a movie playing in the background while she observed from a great distance. It was easier this way, safer somehow. Her supervisor at work had started asking questions. Nothing accusatory, just gentle inquiries about her performance, suggestions for taking a few personal days, reminders about the employee assistance program. Sarah nodded and smiled and promised to consider their advice while knowing she would do nothing. Action required energy she didn't possess, hope she couldn't manufacture. The thought of simply not waking up one morning had begun to feel less like a fear and more like a relief. She imagined the discovery of her absence would barely register as a ripple in the lives of those around her. Her coworkers would express appropriate sympathy. Her family would grieve in that distant way reserved for relatives who had grown apart, and the world would continue spinning without missing a beat. But even in her darkest moments, something held her back. Perhaps it was the last stubborn thread of survival instinct, or maybe just the ingrained habit of showing up to work each day. She went through the motions of living while planning her retreat from it, organizing her few possessions, paying bills early, clearing out her email inbox as if preparing for a very long vacation. On this particular Tuesday evening, as she sat in her apartment watching shadows lengthen across the wall, Sarah made a decision. The weekend was approaching, which meant 2 full days without the distraction of work, 2 days of uninterrupted time to think and remember and hurt. She couldn't face another weekend like the ones that had come before, spent entirely in bed or staring at the television without really seeing it. The prescription bottle felt heavier than usual as she picked it up, its contents rattling like a promise of peace. She had researched the process online, clinical and detached as if she were looking up the weather forecast. It would be gentle, she had learned, like falling asleep and simply choosing not to wake up. As she prepared for what she believed would be her final evening, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The decision once made lifted the weight of uncertainty that had been crushing her for months. She wouldn't have to wonder anymore what tomorrow would bring because there wouldn't be a tomorrow, at least not for her. She had written a brief note, nothing dramatic or accusatory, just a simple explanation that she was tired and couldn't continue. She thanked the few people who had tried to help and apologized for any pain her choice might cause. The note sat on her kitchen table, sealed in an envelope addressed to her sister. But as Sarah prepared to take the step that would end her pain forever, she had no idea that across town, in a small apartment in the Modoc tribal housing complex, a 7-year-old boy named Tommy was having a conversation with his father that would change both their lives. Tommy had been asking questions about his mother, who had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and his father, David, was struggling to explain why some people left and never came back. In a few hours, their paths would cross in the most unexpected way, and Sarah would discover that sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, delivered by the most innocent messengers. But for now, she sat in her apartment believing her story was ending, unaware that it was actually about to begin. David Running Bear stood at his kitchen window, watching his son Tommy play in the small yard behind their apartment. The boy was talking to himself as he often did, carrying on elaborate conversations with imaginary friends who seemed more real to him than most of the adults in his life. At 7 years old, Tommy had already experienced more loss than many people face in a lifetime. Yet he possessed a resilience that both amazed and worried his father. The Modoc tribal housing complex where they lived was a collection of modest apartments built in the 1980s, showing their age in peeling paint and creaking floors but maintained with the pride of a community that understood the value of having a place to call home. David had grown up here, left for college and a brief career in Portland, then returned after his wife Maria's death 2 years ago. Coming home had felt like both a surrender and a salvation. Maria's accident had shattered their small family in ways David was still discovering. One moment she had been laughing at something Tommy had said over breakfast. The next she was gone, victim of a drunk driver who walked away from the crash without a scratch. The irony wasn't lost on David that his wife, who had never touched alcohol due to her family's history with addiction, had been killed by someone who couldn't put down a bottle. Tommy had handled his mother's death with the peculiar adaptability of children, accepting explanations about heaven and watching clouds while asking when Mommy would come back from her trip. But as months passed and understanding grew, his questions had become more complex, more painful to answer. Recently, he had begun asking why other kids had mommies and he didn't, why his daddy looked sad all the time, why their house felt so quiet. David did his best to fill both parental roles, but some days the weight of single parenthood felt overwhelming. He worked at the Tribal Cultural Center, helping to preserve Modoc traditions and languages, work that felt meaningful but paid modestly. Between his job, maintaining their home, and trying to meet all of Tommy's emotional needs, David often collapsed into bed feeling like he had failed at everything that mattered. The tribal community had rallied around them in those early months after Maria's death. Elders brought food and wisdom, friends offered babysitting and shoulders to cry on, and the extended family that characterized reservation life ensured that Tommy never lacked for attention or care. But as time passed and the immediate crisis faded, David found himself increasingly isolated, struggling with grief he didn't know how to process while trying to model strength for his son. Dating seemed impossible and inappropriate. How could he even think about another woman when Maria's clothes still hung in their closet, when her coffee cup remained in the dish drainer, where she had left it that final morning? Tommy had begun asking about getting a new mommy with the casual directness that only children possess, apparently unaware of how each question drove a spike through his father's heart. On this particular evening, as David prepared a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, Tommy burst through the back door with his usual enthusiasm, dirt on his knees and a grasshopper cupped carefully in his hands. "Daddy, look what I found." "Can we keep him?" David smiled despite his exhaustion. "Grasshoppers like to live outside, buddy. How about we visit him in the yard instead?" Tommy considered this seriously, then nodded and ran back outside to release his new friend. When he returned, he climbed onto a chair at their small kitchen table and fixed his father with the intense stare that usually preceded important announcements. "Daddy, I've been thinking," Tommy began, swinging his legs under the table. "Mrs. Henderson next door has a husband, and Jenny at school has a mommy and daddy, and even Mr. Garcia at the store has a wife who brings him lunch." David felt his chest tighten. These conversations had been happening more frequently, and he never knew how to navigate them without either dismissing his son's feelings or making promises he couldn't keep. That's true, Tommy. Different families have different people in them. But we used to have Mommy, and now it's just us, Tommy continued with the logical progression that characterized his thinking. Don't you think we need someone else? Someone who could help make breakfast and read stories and maybe teach me how to braid hair like the girls at school? The mention of hair braiding hit David particularly hard. Maria had been teaching Tommy traditional Modoc braiding techniques, sitting with him for hours as he struggled with the coordination required to weave sweetgrass and beads into patterns that told stories of their people. Since her death, Tommy's hair had grown long and wild, and David's clumsy attempts at braiding resulted in lopsided, loose plaits that fell apart within hours. I know you miss having a mommy, David said carefully, stirring the soup to avoid meeting his son's eyes. I miss Mommy too, but finding someone to be part of our family isn't as simple as going to the store. Tommy nodded seriously, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. I know, Daddy. That's why I've been asking the Creator to send us someone. Grandma Rose says the Creator listens to children extra carefully because our hearts are still pure. David's grandmother had indeed filled Tommy's head with traditional beliefs about prayer and the interconnectedness of all beings. While David appreciated his son's spiritual grounding, he worried about setting up unrealistic expectations about divine intervention in their personal lives. What exactly have you been asking for? David asked, genuine curiosity overriding his concerns. Tommy's face lit up with the excitement of a child sharing a secret plan. I asked for someone who needs us as much as we need her. Someone who's sad like you are sometimes, so she'll understand. And someone who smells nice and makes good cookies and doesn't mind when I ask too many questions. The specificity of his son's prayer list brought a genuine smile to David's face for the first time in days. Those sound like very reasonable requests. And I asked for someone who's not too far away, Tommy added, because I don't want to wait forever, and I think you need help sooner than later. Before David could respond to this observation, Tommy had slid down from his chair and was heading toward the front door. I'm going to check the mail, he announced. Sometimes answers come in the mail. David watched his son skip down the walkway toward the cluster of mailboxes that served their section of the complex, marveling at his optimism and resilience. 7 years old, and Tommy already possessed a faith that his 31-year-old father had lost somewhere between college and marriage and grief. As he ladled soup into bowls, David allowed himself to wonder what it would be like to share these daily rituals with another adult. Not to replace Maria, which seemed impossible, but to create something new, a different kind of family that could honor her memory while moving forward into an uncertain future. He had no way of knowing that at that very moment. Less than 5 miles away, a woman named Sarah was sitting in her apartment making very different plans for her future. Their worlds were about to collide in a way that would surprise them both, initiated by a 7-year-old boy who believed in the power of prayer and the possibility of second chances. Sarah had been sitting in her car for 20 minutes staring at the bottle of pills in her lap and trying to summon the courage to take the final step. She had driven to Riverside Park, a place she and her ex-husband used to visit during happier times, thinking it would be fitting to end her story where so many better chapters had been written. But now, surrounded by the sounds of evening settling over the small city, she felt paralyzed by an unexpected hesitation. The park was nearly empty except for a few joggers and dog walkers taking advantage of the cooler evening air. Children's laughter drifted from the playground across the parking lot, where a father was pushing his daughter on a swing while a little boy waited his turn, chattering excitedly about something Sarah couldn't hear from this distance. The scene was so normal, so full of life and promise, that it made her plan feel even more surreal. She had written the note, organized her affairs, even cleaned her apartment so whoever found her wouldn't have to deal with the mess of her daily existence. Everything was ready except for her resolve, which seemed to waver each time she looked at the pills. They had seemed like such a clean solution in the privacy of her apartment. But here in the open air, surrounded by evidence of ongoing life, her certainty crumbled. A knock on her passenger window made her jump, nearly dropping the pill bottle. A little boy with long black hair and bright dark eyes was peering at her through the glass, his face pressed against the window, with the fearless curiosity that belonged exclusively to children. Behind him stood a man who was clearly his father, looking embarrassed and apologetic. "Tommy, get away from there," the man called, hurrying over to collect his son. "I'm so sorry," he said to Sarah through the partially open window. "He saw you sitting here and wanted to make sure you were okay. He's very social." Sarah quickly shoved the pill bottle into her purse and rolled down the window, forcing what she hoped was a normal smile. "It's fine, really. I was just thinking." Tommy had ignored his father's attempt to pull him away and was studying Sarah with the intense focus that children reserve for things that genuinely interest them. "You look sad," he announced with the brutal honesty of 7-year-olds. "Are you crying?" "Tommy," his father said more firmly, his face flushing with embarrassment. That's not polite to say, but Sarah found herself oddly touched by the boy's directness. When was the last time someone had simply acknowledged her pain instead of trying to fix it or explain it away? "I am a little sad," she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Tommy nodded as if this confirmed something important. "My daddy gets sad sometimes too. It's because my mommy went to heaven and can't come back." "Why are you sad?" "Tommy," his father said again, but more gently this time. He looked at Sarah with apologetic brown eyes that held their own weight of sorrow. "I'm David Running Bear. This is my son Tommy. We live in the tribal housing just down the road." "Sarah Martinez," she replied, finding it strange to introduce herself when she had planned to never speak to another person again. "It's nice to meet you both." Something in her tone must have caught David's attention because he studied her face more carefully, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. "Are you all right? You seem—" "I'm fine," Sarah said quickly, but the words came out too sharp, too defensive. Tommy was still staring at her with those perceptive dark eyes, as if he could see right through her carefully constructed facade. "You don't look fine," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "You look like my daddy did when Mommy first went away. All empty inside." The accuracy of his observation hit Sarah like a physical blow. This child, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, had identified something in her that she had been trying to hide from everyone, including herself. David placed a protective hand on his son's shoulder. "Tommy has a gift for seeing things others miss," he said softly. "It can be unsettling sometimes." "It's not unsettling," Sarah found herself saying. "It's refreshing. Most people pretend not to notice." A moment of understanding passed between the two adults, a recognition of shared pain that needed no explanation. They were both survivors of different kinds of loss, both struggling to rebuild lives that had been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. "Are you here alone?" David asked gently, and something in his tone suggested he understood more about her situation than a casual observer should. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The kindness in the stranger's eyes was undoing all the careful emotional walls she had built around her decision. "Daddy," Tommy said suddenly, tugging on his father's sleeve with excitement. "Daddy, I think this is her." "What?" David looked down at his son in confusion. "The lady I was telling you about. The one the Creator is sending us." Tommy turned back to Sarah with a brilliant smile. "I asked for someone who was sad like Daddy, and someone who needed us, and here you are sitting all by yourself looking exactly like that." Sarah felt her chest constrict. "I don't understand." David's face reddened again. "Tommy has been... He's been asking for... He thinks our family needs..." He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound completely insane to a stranger. "I asked the Creator to send us a new mommy," Tommy announced proudly, apparently unaware of his father's mortification. "And you're here, and you're sad, and you need a family just like we need someone to make our family bigger." The simplicity of his logic, the absolute certainty in his young voice left both adults speechless. Sarah stared at this child who had appeared out of nowhere with a solution to problems he couldn't possibly understand, while David wrestled with the urge to sink into the ground. "Tommy, you can't just ask random people to..." David began. "She's not random," Tommy interrupted. "She's exactly what I asked for. Look at her, Daddy, she's perfect." Sarah felt tears starting to form, but for the first time in months they weren't tears of despair. There was something so pure about this child's faith, so unshakable in his belief that the universe would provide what was needed, that it challenged everything she had concluded about her worth and her future. "How old are you, Tommy?" she managed to ask. 7, he replied promptly. "I'll be 8 in 2 months." Daddy says I'm mature for my age, but Grandma Rose says my spirit is older than my body. Tommy talks to everyone, David explained, looking like he wanted to disappear. He doesn't understand about stranger danger or appropriate boundaries. I'm really sorry about this. But Sarah was studying the boy's face, seeing something there that reminded her of herself at that age, before life had taught her to expect disappointment. What made you think I needed a family? Tommy considered this seriously. Because you were sitting here all alone, and you had that look that people get when they've forgotten how to be happy. Like you couldn't remember that good things can happen too. His words hit her with stunning accuracy. When had she stopped believing that good things were possible? When had hope become a luxury she couldn't afford? And, Tommy continued, warming to his subject, Daddy needs someone to help him remember how to smile. He used to smile all the time before Mommy died, but now he only smiles when he thinks I'm not looking. Like he's not allowed to be happy anymore. Both adults were quiet now, struck by the child's perceptive assessment of their emotional states. In his innocent way, Tommy had identified the core of both their struggles. The way grief and despair could become prisons that locked them away from the possibility of joy. The pill bottle seemed to burn through Sarah's purse like a guilty secret. How could she have been planning to end her life just moments before meeting this remarkable child, who saw solutions where she had seen only problems? The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and the weight of a 7-year-old's unexpected wisdom. Sarah found herself studying David's face, noting the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way he held his shoulders as if carrying an invisible burden. He was younger than her, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of natural handsomeness that came from good genes and honest work, rather than conscious effort. I should probably explain, David said finally, running a hand through his hair in what appeared to be a nervous habit. Tommy's been asking a lot of questions lately about family, about why some kids have 2 parents and he only has 1. Our tribal elder, his great-grandmother, told him that sometimes the Creator sends people into our lives when we need them most. And he decided I was sent by the Creator? Sarah asked, finding herself oddly touched by the idea rather than offended. Apparently, David replied with a weak smile, though I have to say his timing is usually better than this. He once asked our mailman if he wanted to be his new daddy. Tommy giggled at this memory. Mr. Peterson was nice, but he already had kids, and besides, he smelled like old socks. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling, a real smile that felt foreign on her face. And I don't smell like old socks? You smell like flowers and sadness, Tommy said seriously. But sadness washes off. Flowers stay. The poetry of his observation caught Sarah off guard. How had this child developed such insight into human nature? She looked at David questioningly. He's always been like this, David explained, pride and worry warring in his voice. Even before Maria died, he seemed to understand things that other kids his age missed. His mother used to say he had an old soul. The mention of his deceased wife created a moment of awkwardness, as if David suddenly remembered he was discussing his son's matchmaking attempts with a complete stranger. I'm sorry. This is incredibly inappropriate. You were probably trying to have some quiet time, and here we are bothering you with our family drama. But Sarah found she didn't want them to leave. For the first time in months, she felt connected to something outside her own pain. It's not drama, she said softly. It's life. Messy, complicated, unpredictable life. Tommy had been following their conversation with the intensity of a child who sensed important things were being decided. Now he stepped closer to Sarah's car window, his small face earnest with purpose. Can I ask you something? He said. Do you have any kids? No, Sarah replied, the word carrying more weight than such a simple answer should. Do you want kids? Tommy pressed, apparently conducting some kind of informal interview. Sarah hesitated. She and her ex-husband had tried for years to have children, enduring fertility treatments and disappointments that had gradually eroded their relationship. The failure to conceive had been one of the factors that drove them apart, each blaming themselves and eventually each other for their inability to create the family they had planned. I used to want children very much, she said finally, surprised by her own honesty. But not anymore? Tommy asked with the persistence of a child who sensed he was getting important information. I thought it was too late for that, Sarah admitted. I thought a lot of things were too late. Tommy nodded solemnly as if her answer confirmed something he had suspected. Then his face brightened with the sudden enthusiasm that seemed to characterize his personality. "It's not too late," he announced with absolute certainty. "You could be my mom and I could be your kid. And Daddy could teach you how to make fry bread. And you could teach me how to braid hair properly because Daddy's terrible at it." "Tommy," David protested, his face flushed with embarrassment. "It's true, Daddy, you are terrible at braiding. Remember when you tried to do my hair for school picture day, and I looked like I stuck my finger in a light socket?" Sarah found herself laughing, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. "You want me to marry your father?" she asked, wanting to make sure she understood the magnitude of what this child was proposing. "Why not?" Tommy asked with the practical directness of 7-year-old logic. "You need a family, we need someone to make our family complete, and you both look sad in the same way. Grandma Rose says that when people are sad in the same way, they can help each other remember how to be happy." The wisdom embedded in his simple statement took Sarah's breath away. She looked at David, who was clearly mortified by his son's bold proposal but also seemed curious about her response. "Tommy," David said gently, "you can't just ask people to marry us. Marriage is complicated. People need to know each other, to care about each other, to love each other," Tommy finished helpfully. "Yes, exactly. And that takes time." Tommy considered this seriously, then looked back at Sarah. "Do you think you could learn to love us? Because I think I could love you pretty easily. You have kind eyes and you didn't get mad when I said you look sad, and you smell better than anyone Daddy has dated since Mommy died." "You've been dating?" Sarah asked David, surprised by the pang of something that might have been jealousy. "Not really," David said quickly. "A few coffee meetings that went nowhere." "Tommy's being generous when he says I've been dating. Mrs. Patterson brought you cookies 3 times, Tommy pointed out. And she always wore too much perfume and laughed too loud at things that weren't funny." Sarah found herself increasingly charmed by this unusual conversation. When was the last time she had discussed anything more significant than work deadlines or grocery lists? When had anyone last cared enough about her feelings to ask direct questions about her hopes and dreams? "Can I tell you something?" she said to Tommy, feeling like she was about to step off a cliff into unknown territory. "A little while ago I was feeling so sad that I thought maybe it would be better if I wasn't here anymore." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding beyond his years. "You mean like going to heaven like Mommy did?" "Something like that," Sarah said carefully. "But then you met us," Tommy said with satisfaction. "And now you don't want to go to heaven yet." It wasn't exactly a question, but Sarah found herself nodding anyway. The truth was that meeting this remarkable child and his grief-stricken father had shifted something fundamental in her perspective. The future that had seemed so bleak an hour ago now contained unexpected possibilities. "I have an idea," Tommy announced, his face lighting up with inspiration. "Why don't you come have dinner with us? Daddy made soup and we have extra, and you could see if you like our house and if we're the kind of people you could be a family with." Both adults stared at him, stunned by the audacity of his suggestion. Sarah felt her heart racing as she considered the proposal. It was crazy, reckless, the kind of impulsive decision she never made. But then again, an hour ago she had been planning to end her life, so perhaps a little recklessness was exactly what she needed. "You don't have to," David said quickly, reading the uncertainty in her face. "I know this is all very overwhelming and strange." But Sarah was already making her decision, surprising herself with its clarity. "Actually," she said, turning off her car engine, "dinner sounds perfect." The drive to David and Tommy's apartment was surreal for Sarah, following their pickup truck through neighborhoods she had never explored despite living in the same city for 5 years. The Modoc tribal housing complex was tucked away behind a grove of oak trees, a collection of simple but well-maintained buildings that formed a close-knit community. Children played in common areas while adults sat on porches, creating the kind of neighborly atmosphere that Sarah had only seen in movies. As they pulled into the parking area, Sarah's anxiety began to surface. What was she doing? 3 hours ago she had been planning to end her life, and now she was having dinner with strangers who felt oddly familiar. The whiplash of her emotional reversal left her feeling dizzy and uncertain. Tommy bounded out of his father's truck and ran to her car window before she could change her mind. "Come on," he said excitedly. "Wait until you see my room. I have a turtle shell that my grandpa gave me, and a rock collection, and pictures of my mommy." The casual mention of his deceased mother reminded Sarah that she was entering a family still actively grieving, still learning how to function without the woman who had been their center. What right did she have to intrude on their healing process? David seemed to sense her hesitation as she sat in her car, key still in the ignition. He approached her window with Tommy dancing impatiently beside him. "You know," he said gently, "if this feels too weird or overwhelming, we can do this another time. Tommy gets excited about new people, but I understand if you need some space to process everything that's happened." His kindness, the way he offered her an easy exit without making her feel guilty, only reinforced Sarah's growing sense that she had stumbled into something extraordinary. When was the last time someone had been so considerate of her emotional state? "It does feel weird," she admitted. "But weird in a good way, I think. Like maybe weird is exactly what I need right now." Tommy clapped his hands together with delight. "I told you she was perfect, Daddy. She likes weird things just like us." As they walked toward the apartment, Sarah noticed the small details that spoke of a life carefully rebuilt after tragedy. A bicycle leaning against the porch rail, its training wheels suggesting Tommy was still learning. Wind chimes made from shells and beads that caught the evening light. A small garden where tomatoes and peppers grew alongside traditional plants she didn't recognize. "Maria started that garden," David said, following her gaze. "Tommy and I try to keep it going, but we're not as good at it as she was." The traditional plants were her specialty. She was learning about medicine plants from the tribal elders. She wanted to be a healer, Tommy added proudly, like the old-time Indian women who could cure anything with plants and prayers. Inside, the apartment was modest but warm, filled with the kind of personal touches that made a space feel like a home, rather than just a place to live. Photographs covered one wall, showing a beautiful woman with long black hair and Tommy's same bright eyes. Maria had been stunning, Sarah realized with a pang of inadequacy. How could she ever measure up to such obvious perfection? But as Tommy gave her a tour of their small space, chattering about each treasure and memory, Sarah began to understand that this wasn't about replacement or comparison. This was about three people who had each suffered losses learning to create something new together. "This is where Mommy used to sit and do her beadwork," Tommy explained, pointing to a chair by the window where a half-finished piece of jewelry lay on a small table. "Daddy doesn't know how to finish it, but he won't put it away either." David looked embarrassed. "I keep meaning to learn, but every time I try, it just reminds me of how much I don't know about her world." Sarah examined the delicate beadwork, recognizing the skill and patience required to create such intricate patterns. "It's beautiful. The colors tell a story, don't they?" "How did you know that?" Tommy asked with excitement. "Most people just see pretty beads." "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "Something about the way they're arranged seems intentional, like a language I don't speak but can sense." David looked at her with surprise and something that might have been admiration. Maria used to say that some people could read the stories in traditional beadwork even if they hadn't been taught. She said it was a gift. As they settled around the small kitchen table for dinner, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in months. The soup was simple but flavorful, and Tommy's constant chatter filled any awkward silences. He told her about school, his friends, his plans to learn traditional dancing, and his ongoing project to teach his father how to braid hair properly. "Show her your terrible braiding." "Daddy?" Tommy commanded between spoonfuls of soup. "Maybe later," David said with a laugh. "I don't want to scare her away on the first visit." "You can't scare me away," Sarah said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "I'm tougher than I look." "Are you?" David asked seriously, and she sensed he was asking about more than just her tolerance for bad hair braiding. "I'm still here," she said simply, and they both understood she meant more than just sitting at their dinner table. After dinner, Tommy insisted on showing Sarah his rock collection, each specimen accompanied by elaborate stories about where he had found it and what special properties he believed it possessed. His favorite was a piece of obsidian that his grandfather had given him. "Grandpa Joe says obsidian is volcanic glass," Tommy explained solemnly. "It comes from deep in the earth where everything is hot and dangerous, but when it cools down, it becomes something beautiful and useful. Like people who go through hard times and come out stronger." Sarah held the smooth black stone, feeling its weight and warmth. "Your grandfather sounds very wise." "He died last year," Tommy said matter-of-factly. "But Daddy says his wisdom stays with us as long as we remember his stories." The casual way Tommy discussed death and loss struck Sarah as remarkably healthy. This child had experienced more grief than many adults, yet he seemed to have integrated it into his worldview without becoming bitter or fearful. How had he learned such resilience at such a young age? As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself participating in the bedtime routine without consciously deciding to do so. She listened to Tommy read from a book about traditional Modoc stories, helped him brush his teeth, and sat on the edge of his bed as David told him a story about Coyote, the trickster figure who appeared in many Native American tales. "Will you come back tomorrow?" Tommy asked sleepily as David tucked him in. Sarah looked at David questioningly, not wanting to make promises she might not keep. He nodded almost imperceptibly, giving her permission to answer honestly. "Would you like me to come back?" she asked. "Yes," Tommy said with absolute certainty. "I think you belong here. I think the Creator knew exactly what he was doing when he sent you to us." As they quietly left Tommy's room and returned to the living area, Sarah felt a strange sense of completion, as if she had found a piece of herself she hadn't known was missing. The apartment that had seemed small during her tour now felt cozy and welcoming, a place where she could imagine building a life. "He's an amazing kid," she said to David as they settled on the couch with coffee. "He is," David agreed. "Sometimes I think he's handling all of this better than I am. He seems to have this unshakable faith that everything will work out the way it's supposed to." "And what do you think?" Sarah asked. "Do you think everything works out the way it's supposed to?" David was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "I used to think so. When Maria and I were first married, when Tommy was born, everything seemed to fall into place so perfectly. But when she died," he shrugged helplessly, "I started wondering if the universe was just random, if believing in purpose and meaning was just a way to make sense of senseless things. And now?" He looked at her directly, his brown eyes serious and searching. "Now I'm thinking maybe Tommy's right. Maybe you were exactly where you needed to be tonight, and maybe we were exactly where we needed to be to find you." Sarah felt her breath catch. The implications of his words, the possibility that her darkest moment had led to this unexpected connection, challenged everything she had believed about her life and her worth. "David," she said carefully, "I need you to know that when you found me tonight, I wasn't in a good place. I was planning to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she could see in his eyes that he understood. "I know," he said quietly. "I could see it in your face, in the way you were holding yourself. Tommy saw it too, which is probably why he was so determined to bring you home with us. Doesn't that scare you? That your son brought home someone who was ready to give up on everything?" David considered this seriously before answering. "It might have a few hours ago. But watching you tonight, seeing how you are with Tommy, how you fit into our evening like you've always been part of it, I think maybe you weren't ready to give up. I think maybe you were just ready for something different." 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself standing in David's kitchen at 6 in the morning, attempting to braid Tommy's hair for school while he wiggled impatiently and offered running commentary on her technique. She had been coming by every evening after work, gradually becoming part of their daily routines in a way that felt both natural and miraculous. "You're getting better," Tommy announced as she worked the 3 sections of his long black hair into a reasonably neat plait. "But you still pull too tight at the top. Mommy used to say hair should be braided like you're petting a cat, gentle but firm." Sarah smiled, no longer feeling a pang of inadequacy when Tommy mentioned his mother. Over the past weeks, she had learned that Maria's presence in their lives wasn't something to compete with, but rather something to honor and learn from. Tommy's casual references to his mother had become a way of including Sarah in family history, rather than excluding her from it. "Like this?" Sarah asked, loosening her grip and working more carefully. "Perfect," Tommy said with satisfaction. "You're definitely getting the hang of it." David emerged from the bathroom, hair still damp from his shower, and stopped to watch the braiding lesson with a smile that had become increasingly frequent over the past weeks. The deep sadness that had marked his features when they first met was still there, but it no longer dominated his expression. Instead, it had become one note in a more complex emotional symphony that included hope, contentment, and something that was beginning to look like happiness. "How's our hair expert doing this morning?" he asked, dropping a kiss on top of Tommy's head. "Sarah's almost as good as Mommy was," Tommy announced proudly, "and she promised to teach me how to do girl braids too, in case I want to wear my hair different sometimes." The casual way Tommy had begun referring to Sarah's promises as established facts touched her deeply. When had this child decided to trust her so completely? When had she become someone worth counting on? Speaking of promises, David said, pouring coffee into the travel mug Sarah had started keeping at their apartment. Are you still planning to come to the tribal gathering this weekend? Sarah's stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation. The gathering would be her first time meeting David's extended family and community. The people who had known and loved Maria, who would inevitably compare Sarah to the woman whose place she was gradually filling. David had assured her that his family was curious but welcoming, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to face some kind of test. If you still want me there, she said, accepting the coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Of course we want you there, Tommy said, spinning around to face her with his newly braided hair swinging. Grandma Rose is dying to meet you. She says she can tell a lot about a person's spirit just by looking at them. No pressure, David said with a grin, but Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. He understood her anxiety about meeting his family, just as she was beginning to understand his own fears about moving forward with their relationship. They had been taking things slowly, carefully, both of them aware that they were building something on the foundations of loss and healing. There had been long conversations on his couch after Tommy went to bed, tentative kisses that felt like promises, and gradually increasing physical intimacy that honored both their need for connection and their respect for the gravity of what they were creating. Sarah had moved some of her belongings into their apartment, but she still maintained her own place, unsure whether her presence in their lives was a temporary refuge or a permanent transformation. David never pressured her for definitions or timelines, seeming to understand that healing happened at its own pace and couldn't be rushed. I want to be there, Sarah said firmly, making the decision as she spoke. I want to meet the people who are important to you. Tommy whooped with delight and threw his arms around Sarah's waist. This is going to be the best gathering ever. You can meet everyone and they can see how perfect you are for us, and maybe Grandma Rose will do a blessing ceremony for our new family. Tommy, David said gently, remember what we talked about? We can't assume Sarah wants to be blessed into our family without asking her first. Sarah looked at this man who had become so careful with her feelings, so respectful of her autonomy even as his son made bold assumptions about their future. The contrast between David's cautious approach and Tommy's confident certainty sometimes made her feel like she was being courted by two very different people, with two very different timelines. What if I do want to be blessed into your family? She asked quietly, the question surprising all three of them. David's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. Sarah, I'm serious, she said, the words coming faster now as she realized she meant them. I know this is all happening quickly, and I know it's complicated because of everything we've all been through. But I can't pretend anymore that this is temporary for me. I can't pretend that I'm just visiting your life instead of trying to build one with you. Tommy was looking back and forth between the adults with the intense focus of a child who sensed that important decisions were being made. Does this mean you want to marry Daddy for real? Not just because I asked you to, but because you actually want to? Sarah laughed, surprised by how clear her answer was. Yes, Tommy, I want to marry your daddy for real. David set down his coffee mug and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, gathering Sarah into his arms with the kind of intensity that spoke of feelings too long held in check. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had been given a second chance at happiness and was finally ready to embrace it fully. Are you sure? He whispered against her lips. Are you sure you want all of this? The tribal politics, the cultural differences, the memories of Maria that will always be part of who we are? I'm sure, Sarah said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. I want the complications and the messiness and the beautiful, imperfect life you're offering me. I want to learn about traditional plants and beadwork and tribal stories. I want to help Tommy grow up knowing he's loved by multiple people. I want to honor Maria's memory while building something new with you. Tommy had begun bouncing with excitement. I told you, he announced triumphantly. I told you the Creator would send us exactly the right person. Grandma Rose is going to be so proud that her prayers worked. Your prayers worked too, buddy, David said, including his son in their embrace. You never stopped believing that good things could happen to our family. As they stood there in the kitchen, holding each other and laughing through tears of relief and joy, Sarah thought about the bottle of pills that still sat in her purse, untouched since that night in the park. She had kept them as a reminder of how close she had come to missing this, to ending her story just chapters before it became beautiful. That night, 3 weeks ago, she had been convinced that her life was a series of failures and disappointments with no hope of redemption. She had seen herself as broken, unwanted, fundamentally flawed in ways that couldn't be repaired. The idea that anyone could love her, let alone need her, had seemed like a cruel fantasy. But Tommy's innocent faith had challenged every assumption she had made about her worth and her future. His absolute certainty that she belonged with them had given her permission to hope again, to believe that her story might have more chapters than she had imagined. "We should probably get you to school," David said to Tommy, though none of them seemed eager to end the moment. "Can we tell my teacher that Sarah's going to be my mom now?" Tommy asked as he gathered his backpack. "We can tell her that Sarah and I are engaged," David said carefully. "But remember, these kinds of changes take time to make official." "How much time?" Tommy asked with the impatience of childhood. Sarah and David looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. They had been through enough loss and uncertainty to know that life was fragile and time was precious. Why wait when they had already found what they were looking for? "Not very long," Sarah said, making another decision that surprised her with its clarity. "I think maybe we've all waited long enough for good things to happen." As they prepared to start their day, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the chain of events that had led her to this kitchen, this family, this future she never could have imagined. A 7-year-old boy's prayer had saved her life and given her a reason to live, proving that sometimes the most powerful interventions came in the smallest packages. The tribal gathering would be another step in their journey together, a chance for Sarah to be welcomed into a community that valued family, tradition, and the belief that every person had a place in the great web of connection that sustained them all. She was nervous but no longer afraid, ready to embrace whatever came next in this unexpected love story that had begun with the simple words of a child who believed in miracles. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same kitchen where she had first learned to braid Tommy's hair, but now the space had been transformed by the gradual accumulation of their shared life. Her coffee mug sat next to David's on the counter. Her reading glasses rested on the table beside his tribal newspapers, and Tommy's latest art project hung on the refrigerator alongside photographs from their wedding, 6 months earlier. The tribal gathering that had once seemed so intimidating had become the foundation of her acceptance into the Modoc community. Grandma Rose, David's grandmother, had taken one look at Sarah and announced that she had the spirit of someone who had been lost but was found. The blessing ceremony that Tommy had hoped for had taken place under an autumn sky, with tribal elders welcoming Sarah not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as someone who had always belonged and simply needed to find her way home. "Mom, can you help me with this?" Tommy called from the living room, where he was working on a school project about family history. At 8 years old, he had grown taller and more confident, but he still possessed the same intuitive wisdom that had brought them all together. Sarah smiled at hearing him call her mom, a title that had evolved naturally over the months without any formal declaration or awkward conversations. Tommy had begun using it shortly after their engagement, as if the word had simply been waiting for the right moment to appear. David's eyes had filled with tears the first time he heard it, and Sarah had understood that she was being given a gift that couldn't be earned or demanded, only received with gratitude. "What kind of help do you need?" Sarah asked, joining Tommy on the floor where he had spread out photographs, documents, and art supplies. "I'm supposed to make a family tree, but our family is kind of complicated," Tommy explained. "I have Mommy Maria in heaven, and you as my mom here, and Daddy and all our relatives, and I don't know how to put everyone in the right places." Sarah studied the project, understanding Tommy's dilemma. Traditional family trees assumed simple nuclear families with clear lineage, but real families were often more complex, shaped by loss and love and the conscious choice to build connections across biological boundaries. "What if we make a different kind of tree?" Sarah suggested. "Instead of a regular family tree, what if we make a tree that shows all the people who love you and help you grow, even if they're connected to you in different ways?" Tommy's face lit up with understanding. "Like how some branches grow up toward the sun and some grow out to the sides, but they're all part of the same tree?" Exactly like that. As they worked together, cutting and pasting and drawing connections between the important people in Tommy's life, Sarah reflected on how much her own understanding of family had expanded over the past year. She had grown up thinking family was defined by blood and law, but living with David and Tommy had taught her that the strongest families were often the ones created by choice, necessity, and love. Maria's photograph held the place of honor in Tommy's family tree, surrounded by pictures of her parents and siblings, all of whom had embraced Sarah with the warmth of people who understood that loving Tommy meant supporting anyone who contributed to his happiness. Sarah had worried initially about being compared to Maria, but the tribal community had helped her understand that she wasn't replacing anyone. She was simply adding another layer of love to a child who had room in his heart for multiple mothers. David arrived home from work to find Sarah and Tommy surrounded by their project, both of them covered in glue and glitter, laughing as they tried to attach a photograph of their dog, Coyote, to one of the outer branches. "How's the family tree coming along?" he asked, settling on the floor beside them. "It's not really a tree anymore," Tommy explained happily. "It's more like a family forest. See, here's Mommy Maria's tree, and here's Sarah's tree, and here's your tree, Daddy. And they all grow together and share the same soil." David examined their creation with the serious attention that Tommy's projects always received. The family forest was indeed complex with branches and connections that defied conventional categorization, but somehow captured the reality of their blended, chosen multicultural family. "I love it," David said sincerely. "It shows how families can grow in unexpected ways." "That's what Grandma Rose says," Tommy agreed. "She says families are like the seasons. Sometimes people leave, like when the leaves fall off in winter, but then new people come, like flowers in spring, and the tree keeps growing." Bigger and stronger, Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her throat that came whenever Tommy shared the wisdom that seemed to flow through him from the tribal elders who had shaped his understanding of life and loss. This child who had saved her from despair continued to teach her about resilience, acceptance, and the endless capacity of the human heart to expand and include new love. "Speaking of growing families," David said, giving Sarah a meaningful look, "should we tell Tommy our news?" Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, where their biological child was growing due to arrive in the spring. They had discovered the pregnancy 2 weeks earlier, and both had been amazed by how naturally the idea of expanding their family felt. Tommy had been asking for a baby brother or sister for months, apparently as confident about this addition as he had been about Sarah's arrival. "What news?" Tommy asked with the immediate alertness of a child who sensed important information. "Well," Sarah said, pulling Tommy closer, "remember how you've been asking for a baby brother or sister?" Tommy's eyes went wide with excitement. "Really? You're going to have a baby?" "We're going to have a baby," David corrected gently. "All 3 of us together." Tommy whooped with delight and threw himself into Sarah's arms, careful not to squeeze too tightly around her middle, even though he couldn't possibly know about the pregnancy's early stage. "I knew it," he announced. "I've been asking the Creator for a baby, and Grandma Rose said that when you ask for something with a pure heart, it usually happens, just maybe not when you expect it." As they celebrated together, surrounded by the evidence of their complicated, beautiful family history spread across the living room floor, Sarah thought about the remarkable journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, she had been convinced that her life was ending, that she had nothing to offer the world and no reason to continue existing. Now she was part of a family that included the living and the dead, the biological and the chosen, the traditional and the unconventional. She was a mother to a child who had found her in her darkest hour and insisted she belonged with them. She was a wife to a man who had learned to love again despite devastating loss. She was a member of a tribal community that had welcomed her not as an outsider but as someone who had always been meant to find her way to them, the prescription bottle that had once represented. Her planned escape from life now sat empty in a drawer, kept as a reminder of how close she had come to missing all of this beauty. She had kept it through their engagement, their wedding, and now their first pregnancy, not as a temptation but as a testament to the power of human connection to transform despair into hope. That evening, as they tucked Tommy into bed and he chattered excitedly about becoming a big brother, Sarah felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with their family being finished, growing, and everything to do with her finally understanding her place in the world. "Thank you," she whispered to Tommy as she kissed his forehead. "For what?" he asked sleepily. "For finding me when I was lost, for knowing I belonged here before I knew it myself." Tommy smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose faith had been vindicated. "I told you the Creator would send us exactly the right person. I just didn't know he was sending you a family too." As Sarah and David quietly left Tommy's room and prepared for bed, They talked about their plans for the new baby, their hopes for Tommy's adjustment to being a big brother, and their gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. They had learned not to take happiness for granted, to appreciate the ordinary moments that made up a life, to trust in the possibility that broken things could be mended and lost people could be found. Outside their window, the moon shone down on the tribal housing complex where children played and families gathered, and elders shared stories that connected past to present to future. It was the same moon that had witnessed Sarah's despair in the park more than a year ago. But now it illuminated a completely different story, one that proved that sometimes the end of one chapter was actually the beginning of something more beautiful than anyone could have imagined. In the morning, they would continue building their life together, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. But tonight they slept peacefully, surrounded by love and possibility, secure in the knowledge that they had found what they had been searching for in each other, and in the remarkable child whose prayer had saved them all.